My name doesn't matter yet. Because before I ever had a name, I had a silence. I was 3 years old when my biological parents signed me away, like I was luggage too heavy to carry, like I was a burden they couldn't afford. I don't remember much from that day. Just the cold smell of paper. The squeak of an office chair. The muffled voices of 2 people I was supposed to call Mom and Dad. I remember my small fingers gripping a doll, its button eye hanging loose. My tears dripping onto its fabric dress. But above all, I remember her. Margaret. The woman who walked into that room with nothing but tired eyes and hands roughened by years of labor. When she reached for me, I froze. But when her palms brushed my cheek, something strange happened. The world stopped hurting. Her touch was worn, her nails cracked, but to me it was softer than any silk I would ever come to know. Her voice was low, steady, almost like a lullaby wrapped in a whisper. Don't cry, sweetheart. You're safe with me. I didn't know then that those words would become the foundation of my entire life. Margaret wasn't rich. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't the kind of woman stories are usually written about. She was a seamstress. A woman who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a noisy street corner, where the walls carried the scent of old thread and steaming fabric. Her sewing machine was older than her bones, clanking with every press of her foot. The neighbors called it that old beast, but for Margaret, it was her bread, her lifeline. And soon, it would become mine, too. My childhood wasn't made of toys and trips to Disneyland. It was made of fabrics. Bolts of cloth stacked in corners, pins stuck in tiny cushions, scissors sharper than the world outside. When I was 4, Margaret let me sit by her side as she stitched gowns for women who never bothered to remember her name. I'd watch her fingers dance, threading needles in a single motion, turning plain fabric into art. To me, she was a magician. Every dress wasn't just a garment, it was a story. And I was her eager apprentice. At school, things weren't easy. Other kids wore shiny sneakers, bought from branded stores at the mall. I wore shoes Margaret had patched 3 times. The stitching was visible, crooked even, but it held strong. Why does your mom make your clothes? They'd laugh. Because they're made with love, I'd whisper back, though sometimes my voice shook. When birthdays rolled around, I didn't have the store-bought glitter dresses. But Margaret would stay up all night, cutting, shaping, and sewing something that no one else in the world had. Why do you do all this for me? I once asked her. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Because one day, my little star, you'll understand, clothes are not just fabric. They're an identity. They tell the world who you are before you even open your mouth. And maybe she didn't know it then. But those words carved themselves into my soul. And maybe she didn't know it then, but those words carved themselves into my soul. By the time I was 10, I wasn't just helping, I was creating. Margaret would hand me scraps of leftover fabric, and I'd stitch together little skirts for my dolls. One day, she looked over my shoulder, watching me work. Her eyes widened. You have the gift, she whispered. I didn't know what she meant. But she did. We lived in a world where the rich wore names, not clothes. Prada, Chanel, Dior. But in the small apartment above the street corner, we stitched dreams. Margaret often said, the world will tell you you're too small, too poor, too forgotten. But every empire begins with a single stitch. And so, I stitched. Every night. Every morning before school. Not just for fun, but because it felt like survival. Each seam pulled me closer to something bigger, something I couldn't name yet. Of course, there were nights I asked about them. My real parents. Margaret never lied. She never painted them as saints. She would sit me down, her eyes heavy with truth, and say, they made a choice, sweetheart. They gave you away. But not because you weren't worthy. Remember this, it was never about you. It was about their weakness. Their greed. I'd cry. I'd ask why I wasn't enough. And she'd hold me until my tears stained her blouse. Then she'd whisper, you were enough. You always were. And when they walked away, I chose you. That's the difference. I didn't understand it fully then. But as I grew older, those words became my armor. By the time I turned 14, I knew fashion wasn't just my interest, it was my destiny. I wanted more than to stitch for nameless women. I wanted to design. To create something that carried identity, history, and power. Margaret encouraged me every step of the way. She'd save every extra coin, buy me sketchbooks, sometimes even sneak fabric scraps from her customers' leftovers. Dream big, she'd tell me. The world doesn't need another dress. It needs your vision. And I dreamed. Oh, I dreamed bigger than that tiny apartment could hold. But dreams come at a cost. There were nights Margaret skipped meals, telling me she wasn't hungry, while I watched her body grow thinner. She never said it, but I knew. She was starving so I wouldn't have to. She carried pain in silence. And yet, she smiled every morning, turning fabric into something divine, as if to say, we are not broken. We are building. The first time I sold something I designed myself, I was 16. It wasn't much, a simple dress, stitched from leftover fabric. But when the woman who bought it twirled in front of the mirror, her face lit up. She didn't ask for a brand name. She didn't ask for a tag. She just said, this feels like me. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just fashion. This was identity. This was power. But life wasn't waiting to hand me success. There were obstacles. Poverty. Mockery. Doors slammed in our faces. There were times I thought of giving up, of folding myself into the same smallness the world kept trying to stitch me into. But Margaret wouldn't let me. Every stitch is a rebellion, she'd say. Every design is a declaration that you refuse to be invisible. And with her by my side, invisibility was no longer an option. So, the girl abandoned at 3, mocked at 10, and dreaming at 16, was about to take her first step into the world of fashion. But little did I know. The higher I climbed, the louder the past would come knocking. And when it did, it wouldn't be for love. It would be for everything I built. Dreams don't begin with fireworks. They don't arrive in grand halls or under spotlights. Sometimes, they begin in the corner of a dusty room. Sometimes, they begin with a single sign. Our dream began with 4 words, painted in Margaret's careful handwriting, placed on a wooden board above our apartment door. Margaret and Company. Tailoring. It wasn't much. Just black paint on old wood. But to us, it was a declaration, we exist. The first customer wasn't glamorous. It was Mrs. Hennings, a woman who lived 2 blocks away, known for gossiping more than she breathed. She came in with a ripped skirt and skepticism in her eyes. You really think people are going to come here? She asked, arms crossed. Margaret only smiled. We don't think, Mrs. Hennings. We know. And when she left wearing a perfectly mended skirt, something changed. By the end of the week, she returned with 3 more neighbors. By the end of the month, we had more orders than we could finish on time. It wasn't profit at first, it was survival. But to me, every stitch was hope. Every dress that left our shop carried a piece of my dream out into the world. Our boutique was small. The walls were cracked. The paint peeled. The floorboards creaked under every step. But when customers walked inside, Margaret would make it feel like a palace. Presentation is half the battle, she'd whisper, arranging fabric like jewels in a display window. I'd sit in the back, sketching designs. Dresses I dreamed of, gowns I imagined on runways I had only seen in magazines. Sometimes I'd show them to Margaret, and she'd look at me as though I had painted the Sistine Chapel. You're not just stitching, she'd tell me. You're creating a future. But the world didn't roll out a red carpet for us. There were long nights where the electricity cut off, and we worked by candlelight. There were mornings when Margaret's hands trembled with exhaustion, but she kept sewing. And there were weeks when rent was overdue, and the landlord banged on our door, threatening to throw us out. I remember one night in particular. I was 15, sitting at the machine, sewing beads onto a dress for a wedding client. The electricity had gone again. The room was dark, except for the flickering candle. My eyes burned from strain, and tears blurred my vision. Mom, I whispered, my voice breaking. What if this is all for nothing? Margaret put down her scissors, walked over, and knelt beside me. She lifted my chin, forcing me to meet her tired eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "do you know what the difference is between those who make it and those who don't?" I shook my head. Persistence. That's it. Not luck. Not money. Just persistence. She kissed my forehead and smiled. "Every stitch you make in this candlelight is proof you refuse to quit. And the world always remembers those who refuse to quit." Those words carried me through every hardship that followed. As the months passed, Margaret & Company wasn't just a tailoring shop anymore. It became a place of transformation. Brides came in with anxious hearts, leaving with gowns that made them cry tears of joy. Mothers brought in daughters for prom dresses, whispering about how they wanted them to feel special, just this once. And in each of those moments, I realized something. Fashion wasn't about fabric. It was about feelings. When a woman slipped into a dress we made, she wasn't just wearing thread. She was wearing confidence, power, identity. And I wanted more of that. By 16, I wasn't satisfied with just repairing and tailoring. I wanted to design collections. Margaret hesitated at first. "Collections? Sweetheart, that's for Paris. For Milan. Not for a little shop above a street corner." But I was relentless. "Why not us?" I asked her one night, showing her pages of sketches. She studied them, silent for a long time. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes sparkled. "Then we'll do it your way." Our first collection wasn't glamorous. It wasn't showcased on a runway. It was a row of dresses hung in our tiny display window, each one stitched by hand from fabric scraps we had begged suppliers to sell us cheaply. We named it the Dawn Collection. The designs weren't perfect. The hems weren't always straight. The fabric wasn't luxurious. But people stopped to stare. They whispered. They pointed. And slowly, they began to come inside. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just surviving. We were creating. But with creation comes attention. And not all attention is kind. Other shops in the area began whispering about us. "That little foster girl and her seamstress mother think they're designers now. They'll never last. They're just playing dress up." At school, the mocking got worse. Girls sneered at me, saying, "So, when do we get to see your designs on the cover of Vogue?" Their laughter echoed like nails against glass. But every insult became fuel. Every doubt became fire. Because Margaret had planted something in me. The unshakable belief that persistence was stronger than privilege. By the time I was 17, we had outgrown our little apartment corner. Our customers demanded more space, more designs, more of us. And so, with trembling hands and an empty bank account, Margaret signed the papers for a small rented shop on Main Street. It was terrifying. The rent was triple what we could afford. The space was drafty, the roof leaked, and the walls were dull. But when I walked inside for the first time, my heart skipped. I could see it. Runways. Collections. The future. "This isn't just a shop," I whispered to Margaret. "This is the beginning." We spent weeks transforming that little space. We painted the walls ourselves, stayed up nights scrubbing floors, hung our fabric rolls like art pieces. When we finally opened our doors, we didn't know if anyone would come. But they did. Word spread about the girl who designed dresses that felt different, and the woman whose stitches were flawless. Soon, women with more money, more influence, started to step in. One of them, Mrs. Carlton, the wife of a local politician, came in for a fitting. She twirled in the mirror, smiling. "Do you realize what you've made?" she asked. I frowned. "A dress?" She shook her head. "No. A statement." That night, I couldn't sleep. Because for the first time, I realized our little dream wasn't just survival anymore. It was a movement. But Margaret never let success blind us. She kept me grounded. When I bragged about Mrs. Carlton's compliments, she chuckled and said, "Sweetheart, never let the applause make you deaf to the work." And she was right. We worked harder, longer, fiercer. Every new client meant new expectations, and failure was not an option. There were still nights when we had nothing but bread for dinner. Still mornings when the landlord threatened eviction. But in the midst of all that struggle, we had something priceless: hope. And then came the moment that would change everything. A local newspaper ran a story about us. The boutique above Main Street, the headline read. They called me the young designer with fire in her eyes. They called Margaret the silent force behind the brand. When I held that newspaper in my hands, tears filled my eyes. Not because of what it said about me, but because for the first time in her life, Margaret, my mother, was seen. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her name was in print. Her work was recognized. And the world was finally beginning to see what I had always known. She was extraordinary. But little did I know, every stitch of success we made was sewing together not just a dream, but a future my biological parents would one day come back to claim. And when they did, they wouldn't be asking for forgiveness. They'd be asking for ownership. Success doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, like a ripple across still water. At first, our boutique was just a whisper in town, a place people stumbled upon by chance. But whispers have a way of turning into echoes, and echoes have a way of turning into storms. It started with Mrs. Carlton, the politician's wife who wore one of my dresses to a charity gala. That night, her gown shimmered under chandeliers, a soft blend of ivory and gold, stitched with more love than fabric. The next morning, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Who made that dress? Where did you get it? I want one too. Our boutique, once a quiet corner of Main Street, became a destination. But with every new customer, the stakes grew higher. These weren't just neighborhood women anymore. These were socialites, bankers' wives, influencers, people whose opinions could build or break you. I remember standing behind the counter one afternoon, sketchbook in hand, when a woman walked in. She wore diamonds on her wrists, arrogance in her eyes. "Are you the designer?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. I nodded. She held out a gown I had made. "This is surprisingly good," she said. "But let's see if you're more than a lucky amateur." She ordered 3 more dresses on the spot, each one more complicated than the last. Beads, silk, hand embroidery. I didn't sleep for 3 nights straight. My fingers bled from the needle. But when she returned, tried them on, and gasped at her reflection, I knew we had passed the test. And word spread further. By the time I turned 18, our little boutique wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a brand. Margaret insisted we rename it. Margaret and Company sounded too small, too local. "Sweetheart," she said one evening, holding my sketches in her hands. "This isn't my dream anymore. It's yours. Your name should be on that window." At first, I resisted. I didn't want to erase her. But she shook her head. "Don't you see? Every stitch you make is mine too. You are my legacy. So let the world know your name." And so, with tears in my eyes, I painted the new sign myself. Evelyn Hart, Atelier. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just a girl with sketches and scraps. I was a designer. The transformation was electric. Magazines began calling. Local fashion journalists visited. Articles appeared, the prodigy of Main Street, from poverty to Paris dreams. I laughed when I saw those headlines. Paris? That was a world away. But Margaret only smiled knowingly. "Don't laugh, Evelyn," she whispered. "One day, they'll be right." Our days became a blur of fittings, deadlines, and endless fabric. But there were moments, small, quiet ones, that remain etched in my heart. Like the night we stayed up past midnight, sipping tea, while Margaret carefully taught me how to stitch lace without tearing it. Or the morning we celebrated our first 5-figure sale with nothing more than toast and jam. Laughing like millionaires. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. And then came the breakthrough. A local fashion editor, Mrs. Langley, visited our shop one rainy afternoon. She browsed quietly, running her fingers over seams, inspecting details like a detective at a crime scene. Finally, she looked at me. "You have something," she said simply. 2 weeks later, our boutique was featured in her magazine. The new face of independent fashion, Evelyn Hart. The article called me bold, unafraid, revolutionary in my simplicity. But what struck me most was the last line. She may be young, but her designs carry the wisdom of someone who has lived 1,000 lives. When I read that, I cried. Because she wasn't just writing about me. She was writing about Margaret. About everything she had poured into me. From that moment on, life was never the same. Orders poured in, not just from our city, but from across the country. Our tiny shop overflowed with fabric, clients, and chaos. There were times Margaret and I slept on the boutique floor, too tired to walk upstairs. But every struggle felt worth it. Every dress that left our hands carried a piece of our story. And then, the world noticed. It began with an invitation. A regional fashion week. We weren't famous. We weren't established. But someone had whispered our name in the right room. I still remember holding that envelope, my hands trembling. "Mom," I whispered. "They want me to showcase my collection." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I told you, sweetheart. Paris will come one day. But tonight, the world is opening its door." The weeks leading up to the show were brutal. We had no money for fancy fabrics. No team of seamstresses. Just us. But Margaret and I worked like soldiers. We begged suppliers for scraps of silk. We stitched through nights, our hands aching. And slowly, piece by piece, my collection came to life. The Phoenix collection. Every gown symbolized rebirth. Rising from ashes. Turning pain into beauty. It was my life, translated into fabric. The night of the show, I stood backstage, heart pounding. Models strutted in my designs, lights blazing, cameras flashing. When the final dress, a crimson gown with hand-sewn feathers, swept across the runway, the audience gasped. And when the applause came, it wasn't polite. It was thunderous. I cried backstage, collapsing into Margaret's arms. "We did it," I sobbed. "We really did it." She kissed my forehead, whispering, "This is only the beginning." And she was right. From that night forward, doors flew open. Investors called. Buyers wanted exclusives. Fashion critics who once ignored us now praised us. We went from a local boutique to a national name. And slowly, whispers of international recognition began to rise. But with success came something else. Something darker. I began to notice Margaret growing weaker. Her hands shook more often. She coughed late at night when she thought I was asleep. "Just tired, sweetheart. Nothing more." I wanted to believe her. I had to believe her. Because the idea of losing her was unthinkable. The world was finally seeing me, but I didn't realize. I was about to lose the person who had seen me all along. They never tell you. That success feels different when the person you love most begins to slip away. To the world, I was Evelyn Hart, the rising star of fashion. To the magazines, I was the girl who came from nothing. To the buyers, I was the next big thing. But at home, I was just a daughter, watching her mother fade. It began subtly. Margaret would forget things. A stitch left unfinished. A name misremembered. Then came the coughing fits, violent, tearing, leaving her breathless. I begged her to see a doctor. But she shook her head. "Sweetheart, we can't afford hospitals. Besides, I'm fine. Just tired." But I knew. Somewhere deep inside, I knew. One evening, I found her collapsed beside the sewing machine. Her hands, those hands that had stitched my entire life together, were trembling so badly she couldn't even hold a needle. "Mom!" I screamed, rushing to her side. She forced a smile through the pain. "Don't cry, Evelyn. Please, don't cry." But I couldn't stop. Because for the first time, I saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't tired. She was sick. Dying. The diagnosis came soon after. Stage 4 lung cancer. Irreversible. Unstoppable. The kind of word that feels like a knife slicing through your future. I sat in that sterile hospital room, staring at the doctor's lips moving, but hearing nothing. All I could see was Margaret, my mother, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. And in that moment, all the gowns, the collections, the applause, none of it mattered. Because what is success without the person who gave it meaning? The following months were the hardest of my life. I became two people. By day, I was Evelyn Hart, the designer. Smiling for cameras. Attending fittings. Pretending to be unstoppable. By night, I was Evelyn, the broken daughter. Holding Margaret's hand in hospital rooms. Whispering prayers into the dark. I would lay beside her hospital bed, my sketches spread out across the floor. "Look, Mom," I'd whisper. "This one's for next season. Do you like it?" Her tired eyes would brighten, just a little. "Beautiful," she'd whisper back. "Promise me, Evelyn, don't stop. No matter what happens, don't stop." I promised. But inside, I already felt myself breaking. The last week came faster than I imagined. Margaret grew weaker. Her voice turned to whispers. Her once strong hands, the hands that had raised me, taught me, built me, now lay fragile against the sheets. On her final night, I sat by her bed, my head resting on her chest, listening to her fading heartbeat. She brushed my hair with trembling fingers. "You were always mine," she whispered. "They gave you away. But I chose you. And I'd choose you again, in every lifetime." Tears poured down my face as I clung to her. "I love you, Mom. Please, please don't leave me." She smiled faintly. "I'll never leave you." "Not really. I'll be in every stitch, every design, every dream." And with that, she was gone. The world outside kept spinning. But mine stopped. I buried her in a small cemetery on the edge of town. There were no lavish funerals, no long speeches. Just me, a coffin, and the unbearable silence of goodbye. When they lowered her into the earth, I felt like they were burying me too. Because who was I, without her? For weeks, I couldn't enter the boutique. The sewing machine sat silent. The sketches gathered dust. The sign Evelyn Hart, Atelier mocked me like a cruel joke. People knocked on the door, demanding their dresses. Journalists called, asking for interviews. But I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't care anymore. What was the point of designing when the only person I wanted to impress was gone? One night, I sat alone in the boutique, surrounded by unfinished gowns. The silence pressed against me like a weight. And then, I saw it. A small box on the sewing table. Margaret's handwriting on the lid. Inside were envelopes. Letters addressed to me. And a flash drive labeled, "For Evelyn." With trembling hands, I plugged it into my laptop. Her face filled the screen. Her voice, weak but steady, filled the room. "My darling Evelyn. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. But don't cry, sweetheart. Because my love for you doesn't end here. It never ends." I broke down, clutching the screen. She continued. "I know the world will try to take from you what we built. They'll say you're too young, too weak, too alone. But listen to me, you are not alone. You have me, in every decision you make. And I've made sure of one thing, they cannot touch what's yours." I frowned through tears. They? Who was she talking about? And then, she explained. "In this box, you'll find partnership deeds, legal documents. They prove what your biological parents did, the day they sold custody of you for money. They gave up their rights to you and to anything tied to you. I kept these safe. Because one day, I knew they might come back. My blood ran cold. My parents. The ones who abandoned me. Margaret knew. She had always known. And she had protected me, even in death. The grief that had crushed me slowly transformed into something else. Something sharper. Anger. They abandoned me. Sold me. Left me in the hands of a woman they thought was disposable. But she wasn't disposable. She was everything. And now they would never take from me what she built. The next morning, I unlocked the boutique. The sun streamed through the windows. For the first time since Margaret's death, I sat at the sewing machine. I threaded the needle with shaking hands. And as the fabric slid beneath my fingers, I whispered to her memory. "This isn't over, Mom. I'll make them see. I'll make the whole world see." Margaret's death was not the end of my story. It was the ignition of a new chapter. One filled with betrayal, revenge, and triumph. Because the very people who abandoned me were about to come knocking. They say ghosts return when you least expect them. But sometimes, those ghosts wear perfume, expensive suits, and fake smiles. It had been 6 months since Margaret's funeral. The boutique, our boutique, was finally stable again. I had stitched through tears, sketched through sleepless nights, and forced myself to turn grief into fabric. Every needle I held felt like I was sewing pieces of my heart back together. And then, they walked in. My biological parents. The ones who had abandoned me for money. The ones who had signed papers, trading their child for a check. The ones who vanished from my life when I was 10, leaving Margaret to pick up the broken pieces. Now, they stood in my boutique, pretending to be family. They spoke of family legacy. They spoke of tradition. They spoke as if I owed them something. But I knew the truth. They didn't see me. They saw the cash registers. They saw the glossy magazines beginning to mention my name. They saw the luxury brand that Margaret and I had built from nothing but cloth and courage. And they wanted it first. I stayed silent. Let them play their game. Let them weave their lies. But when they started talking about ownership, about claiming what's rightfully ours, I knew this was only the beginning of another storm. Because the boutique wasn't just my career. It was my revenge, my proof, my love letter to the only woman who had ever believed in me. And I wasn't about to hand it over. A week later, a lawyer delivered a sealed package. Margaret had left behind more than memories. She had left evidence. Inside the envelope was a flash drive. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. The screen lit up. And there she was. Margaret. My foster mother. My teacher. My best friend. Her voice filled the room, fragile but steady, recorded during her final days. My darling, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone. But I need you to remember, this boutique is yours. Yours alone. Every stitch, every fabric, every dream. You earned it. And in case the past ever comes knocking. She paused. Coughed. Then held up documents, contracts. These papers prove that your biological parents sold custody. They didn't lose you. They traded you. For money. They signed away their rights willingly. I froze. Tears blurred my eyes as I watched the proof unfold. Margaret had anticipated this moment. She had prepared for it. And now, she was still protecting me from beyond the grave. When my parents tried to legally challenge me, I met them with the documents. The partnership deed. The signed custody papers. The recorded will. Their faces collapsed under the weight of truth. The judge's words rang in my ears. This boutique belongs solely to her. Case dismissed. It was more than a victory. It was justice. Justice Margaret had stitched into my destiny with her own hands. But revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet. Elegant. Like silk draped across a runway. I didn't scream at my parents. I didn't chase them away with anger. Instead, I built higher. 6 months later, I launched my first international collection in Paris. Spotlights flashed. Cameras clicked. The world watched as models walked the runway in gowns that carried Margaret's signature embroidery, a style only she and I knew how to stitch. And the collection's name. The Margaret line. Every piece, every design, every collection after that named after her. So when the magazines wrote about me, when fashion critics praised my brand, when celebrities wore my dresses at red carpets, her name was on their lips. Not my parents. Never theirs. My revenge wasn't shouting, wasn't violence, wasn't destruction. It was legacy. The very legacy they tried to steal. I made eternal. But not in their honor. In hers. And now, years later, I tell you this. Revenge doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes, it looks like fabric. Sometimes, it looks like resilience. Sometimes, it looks like love stitched into every seam. My parents thought legacy was something you could claim. But I learned from Margaret that legacy is something you build. So if you're watching this, and you've been betrayed, abandoned, left behind, remember this. You don't need to burn bridges to get even. You can build castles instead. You can create something so powerful, so unforgettable, that it outlives every betrayal. And when the world whispers your name, it won't be your enemies who are remembered. It will be the ones who raised you, the ones who loved you, the ones who believed in you. Because in the end, that's the truest revenge. This was another emotional cinematic story by AINeuraBeat, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you want more journeys of betrayal, revenge, love, and legacy, subscribe, share, and keep watching. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us, family isn't blood, it's love.